This is Inner Healing Paths podcast. Here we discuss the healing of the mind, body, soul, and spirit through a variety of different paths. We have emotional and spiritually minded conversations centering on ancestral healing, psychology, astrology, yoga, meditation, magic, and indigenous spiritual practices of the world. I am your host, Rosa, and I am so happy you are here. Welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of my podcast, Inner Healing Paths. I'm your host, Rosa, and the episode that you're about to listen is actually a very special episode for me. This was a conversation that I had with my dear friend, Sandra Ascencio. And I was just so grateful to her for coming on and sharing her wisdom, her knowledge on healing from trauma. Sandra is a mental health therapist, and she used a technique or a therapy modality known as EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing Therapy. So in the episode, Sandra explains a little bit about what this therapy approach involves, how it's helpful in healing from trauma. Sandra also shares on her journey of becoming a therapist. And I actually didn't know the story, so I was very intrigued to learn how she decided to become a therapist. So again, this was such a special interview. Sandra is such a dear friend. She's such a kind person, and I was just so glad that she was able to come, and I'm so happy to share our conversation with you all. So without further ado, here's a conversation with my friend Sandra Ascencio. Take a listen. Hi, Sandra.
Hi, Rosa.
Thank you so much. I'm doing good. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this podcast interview with me.
It's great to be here.
Yes. So Sandra, let's just go right in. So tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do, so our listeners can get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, of course. So hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Ascencio. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been in, I want to say, the field of helping others, right, since 2009. And doing my private practice for 8 years now. So presently, one of the areas that I focus on, that I'm passionate about, is working with clients who have experienced trauma. Feel really strongly about that, and just being able to help others heal from those experiences.
Wonderful. Thank you. And, as you know, this podcast is called Inner Healing Paths because, I believe that there are so many ways that people can heal from childhood wounds and trauma. So from your perspective, from your experience, how do you see healing happen? How does healing happen?
That's a good question. And I really like how you're explaining that healing happens in different mediums, right? It can be through spiritual healing. It can be with connecting with others, getting in touch with your body, right? The type of healing that I like to work with is the healing where we're processing the events that happened to the individual. And it's a journey, because oftentimes people come in and they say, "Oh, Sandra, when are we, work on this trauma?" And it could be a big trauma, or it can be something that just happened once. And what I often find is that these events are connected to other events, right? And sometimes we continue to repeat those events in different relationships, the way that we go about our lives. And so then when I began working with people, one of the things that I try to do is really identify, right, the reason that they're coming in for, being able to say, okay, this is the trauma that you're identifying, and let's see what else is going on. So a lot of it is just eliciting a little bit of that information. And one of the methods that I really find that really helps people in this process, because we're, it's kind of like that Band-Aid that we're carrying around. And, when you're peeling it off, is, oh my God, just the apprehension, it's going to hurt. I don't want to do it, right? Until, you have somebody really encouraging you and reassuring you that you'll be okay and that you're going to come out a lot better from that. And sometimes it's really fast, the process, and other times it might take some time. So the method that I like using, because it really gets people to like talking about some of these traumas that they have experienced, is EMDR. And that's really, an acronym for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's a big, words that we use to describe the treatment modality. But I find, like that just the questions when I do therapy, and I just, say, hey, tell me about this. Tell me about the earliest memory that you have when you experience this. And just people they just start talking. And it's really powerful to see a lot of the emoting that happens. And even in that space, I can see how there's permission for them to hold, right? That part of themselves that experienced that trauma, whether it was in childhood, whether it was in adulthood, but it gives them that ability to talk about it. And that's what is so efficient with this treatment, right? Like the ability to talk about this or hold it in such a place where you're no longer scared of it.
Yeah, it is such a powerful tool. And for those listeners that are not too familiar with EMDR, how would you, just very briefly, how would you describe it to someone, that just wants to get started, maybe thinking about, because there's so many approaches out there, right, for therapy. And EMDR, I see it as a staple. It really is, one of those tools that, or strategies or techniques that are just so powerful, and a lot of therapists use. So for our listeners that are considering their options, how would you describe the EMDR work that you do with folks?
Yeah, of course. One of the things that I definitely am mindful of when a person is approaching me and they're interested in EMDR, I want to know what drove them to this treatment modality, because, part of the training in EMDR is that you as a therapist get to be on the client's seat. You get to be the person that is talking about some of the difficult experiences that you've had, right? That's to say, we all have had some type of trauma, some type of hardship. So then I'm curious, right? Like, I want to know about that, because in reality, EMDR is an effective modality. It's a staple, like you mentioned. A lot of clinicians are receiving training on it, but also know and understand that sometimes EMDR will be a really good fit for some people, and it might not be for other people. So I always, kind of want to get that information and then assess to see if there are appropriate candidates for this modality. Because I know that once they leave this room, it's going to help, but they might be leaving very flooded, right? Because they just unlock Pandora's box. So that's the way that I see it, and that's the way that I explain it, right? There's going to be that disturbance, and that sometimes you're going to dissociate because you're going in deep, and that's why you need a clinician that is going to be able to support you and help you through that process and really explain to you what is happening, what is this experience, and how come is it that you thought that the trauma was this issue that is actually connected to another bigger issue, right? So in other words, people come in for a traumatic event. The process of EMDR encourages us to identify right? Key moments. And part of it is explaining that this key moment is, it's almost like an error, right? The way that we saved it in our brain, we saved it when we were in moments of terror, agitation, right? And what we're looking to do is bring that information up and have a different narrative about it. Begin to say, instead of this thing happened to me, being able to say, this is how I'm doing better now, right? So kind of coming from this place that you've been able to get past that, and you might not even see it because the error message is still there. So you're pretty much kind of cleaning up that memory and putting it back in. What it does to the person is that they're no longer triggered, or there's less trigger for them. So they're not either, kind of withholding or having a lot of that emotional dysregulation, or when they're reminded of something, they're not shutting down or, experiencing or re-experiencing. And then, of course, you have the movement, the I emphasis is that how we're stimulating these memories, how we bring them up, and how we, processing it is by the eye stimulation, right? So what we do is we have people track our fingers, and I think that this is vertical, right? Like no horizontal. Sometimes I am, and that really
horizontally, and sometimes there's different patterns, right? It could be
right.
horizontally, up and down, sideways.
Yeah. So that's the piece that I think is key in this treatment, right? Because something I explain to people in trauma is, and you might also know this about me, Rosa, I'm also a very attachment-based therapist. And I explain to people, like, if you experience a traumatic event when you were 7 years old, when that event happened, you were 7 years old. You did not have all this knowledge that you have now as an adult and all this other information that you're attaching to this. So then that's why I like this approach, because you're really honing in on that specific piece of memory that you stored in there when you were 7 years old.
Thank you for that explanation. And it's so true. And, a lot of times we respond when we get triggered now, for those that have experienced trauma, when we respond to a trigger, and if it happened at, like you said, 7 years old, we respond with a 7-year-old reaction, right? Because like you said, it gets stored in that way. Your body's response, it's almost like a snapshot, of your sense of your nervous system, and you respond from that point, from a 7-year-old's nervous system response and trauma responses. So I love the way you explained EMDR, because absolutely. And I do a lot of work with the inner child. And what I found with some of my clients is that as we're processing, I don't necessarily talk about the inner child in that way in therapy. But what I've noticed and what I found through my work is that this inner child comes up in the session, and we inevitably go to that place and we connect with that 7-year-old, right? And EMDR gives you a very direct link to your inner child.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's where the meaningful and healing work lies, right? Because all this stuff, it's kind of locked in. And when you really let that child kind of say, this is what I experienced, and when you bring in the resourcing, right? And for EMDR, the resourcing is the ways to cope with those memories, right? And I really love, attachment-based EMDR, because the idea of bringing, images of somebody that's strong, like Superman or Wonder Woman, somebody that is motherly, right? I had a wonderful patient that spoke to me about Sesame Street, and they have a lot of, kind of parental figures, right? and they really identify with those parents, and they were able to bring that image into resourcing that 7-year-old, right? So you have those components that really help facilitate that healing.
So, so wonderful. I love that. You know, I do a lot of that work. Um, and this is where I combine the ancestors in the trauma therapy arena, because this is for a lot of clients, you know, bringing in these protective parental figures is just so, so powerful. But it could really be anything, right? Like you said, it's Sesame Street characters, or some of the characters, not necessarily the puppets, but maybe even the puppets, right? But I mean the adults in the show. I've had people also connect with their grandmothers, and it's just so, so fascinating to see how our mind just goes there, right? And to see what is being elicited in that moment for the purpose of healing. And I do really, you know, I know EMDR is very much science-based, and there's lots and lots of research, but it's also, I've had sessions where it just feels very spiritual, you know, especially when the clients connect to other other figures that are not necessarily in human form. I don't know if you had that experience. You know, they talk about you know, God, of course, and the universe and angels, and it just takes on this whole other spiritual element that is I see it as an added layer to the healing. That is, when we, as trauma therapists, you know, that's not necessarily where we guide, but the patients sometimes, or the clients, just go there. And spirit just takes care of them in that way, right?
And it's fascinating because our training, right, tells us, let them go with that, right? Let them explore what that means, because for the client, that's the reassurance, right? That's the guidance, that's the protective, maternal, wise, you know, being that they need to help them to process their trauma and to heal and to be better. And
absolutely,
the fascinating thing is that they can continue to apply these resources on and on.
So wonderful. And Sandra, just for our listeners, how did you get into this field of doing trauma work? How did you find your calling for helping others heal in this way?
You know, it's a long story, so I'll concise that story, right? So, you know, I started working at a community mental health clinic, and that's just when I graduated from high school, right? And it was a part-time job. And as many of the listeners perhaps know, you know, I'm a Latina, bilingual, English speaking and Spanish speaking. So this clinic that I was working at was a clerk. So it so happened that a lot of the therapists that were there did not speak Spanish, and our population was 90% Spanish speaking, right? So one day they just brought me in to translate. And here I was translating these stories, right? These stories of survival, these stories of traumas and abuse that a lot of these people were experiencing. And I saw a need for bilingual therapists. So that got me interested in psychology, that got me interested in child development. And I pursued that. Then I became a social worker, clinical social worker. And I continued to work with that population, children and trauma. Yeah.
So, a lot of your experience, I know, has been with kids also, right? And babies, right? You also worked with the little ones. You know, so can you tell us a little bit more about that line of work and working with the tiny ones?
Yeah. So so I attended UCLA, where I was pursuing my degree in psychology, and then they had the minors in applied developmental psychology, which is really working with the babies, and that's where I became fascinated about development, by motor skills, learning. How do kids become bilingual, and why is it so fast for them? So, but I also learned, about, hey, what impacts brain development, right? And it's usually neglect, trauma, when the mom is going through severe depression and anxiety, right? So my goal then became, hey, I want to work with the little ones so I can really educate the parents, and I can really work with the child to develop or help the bonding between mom and child, or foster parent and child. So I began working at a clinic in the Valley, and the clinic specifically there worked for 0 to 5, so birth to 5. And I think a lot of us might think, how can a little tiny baby experience trauma, right? So a lot of the trauma that babies are experiencing is in the form of their attachment, right? Sometimes when mom, or they get removed from parents' care, that attachment, right, gets, I want to say broken, but in other words, right, that's what happens. And now the child is moved to another environment that is strange to them. And they begin to have like a lot of, difficulties regulating and trusting. So that's one form of trauma that I worked a lot on, right? Like helping these kids develop secure attachment with that grandparent, that foster parent, or whatever caregiver they were in. Then the ones that, experience some type of abuse, right? So using play therapy, I always tell, and for me, it was always fascinating because kids are just amazingly resilient, and they're willing to go there, because as opposed to us as adults, we're kind of like, no, like, I want to do that. I want to remember, right? Kids are willing and ready to talk, and they're showing you this with their behaviors, with the way that they're playing and interacting with you. And you just need to be willing to go in there with them, right? And that's a lot of the work that I did.
Okay. Oh, that brings to mind, you mentioned kids are so resilient, and they're so open to
Mhm.
to the intervention and the help. I heard somewhere, I don't know where, but I heard that, the reason why kids really, they're so wise, a lot of times they're so intuitive, they have a gut feeling that's stronger than adults sometimes. And that's just because it hasn't been that long since they've been in this realm, right? So they kids, I think of my daughter and how, she has certain reactions to certain people, and she's like 20 months and she already knows, so much. And yeah, and I read somewhere that it's because it hasn't been that long since they were, in spirit form. They haven't been disrupted with life, and they still have that innocence and openness, and curiosity for life that, of course, over the years, through, life and trauma gets taken or gets shifted, and they become adults. And but I love that, and I do believe that so much powerful work can be done directly with children. And at the same time, I could imagine, because I work with children too, and I could imagine for you, sometimes it is frustrating as a child therapist, because they are a product of the environment, and sometimes, working with the parents is sometimes 80% of the work, right? And in helping the parents uh, heal, and that's where the generational trauma piece comes through, right? And sometimes helping the parents heal becomes even more important, because through their healing is how they can really help their little ones
Yes.
with whatever is going on with them.
Exactly, because when a parent brings us their child, they're like, fix him, right? um, with the work that I did in this community mental health clinic, they piloted a program where, yes, the child was your client, but we recognize that the parent would benefit for their own individual therapy. And that allowed for that parent to work on their own issues, whatever was coming up for him, because that little one, and probably you experienced this yourself, Rosa, is that little one triggers your own traumas, whatever those might be, right? And especially when they're at a certain age that trauma happened to you, that's when you will see as the parent. I'm talking about you.
No, yeah, no, absolutely. I see it,
Yeah.
now that I'm a mom, it's like every stage triggers you in a different way. And, me being, a therapist and having all these tools and having done a lot of the healing journey myself, still very much on the process, still healing from a lot. I still get triggered sometimes. And it has, since becoming a parent, it has really pushed me to continue my healing, to seek out, my own support system through a therapist, through energy work, through spirituality, because it brings up so much stuff that you thought you had already worked through. And then here you have a little one, and it's just staring at you in the face when it comes to your triggers.
Yeah. So, I encourage parents, to really seek that help for themselves. And it really facilitates understanding, right? Of, hey, my child is not trying to make me crazy, and you separate the two.
And that's the key, right? To be able to separate, to say, okay, this is my baby being a baby.
Yeah.
And these are my issues, my triggers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Such important work. And I just feel like there's not enough programs out there in the community, especially in the communities that are where this is such a huge need, where I think trauma is everywhere, of course, but there's communities that are just impacted with just a higher level of, or layers of trauma, right? With societal and systemic. And I just feel like there's not enough. I didn't know there was programs like what you just described. I didn't know there was a program designed for that, to address really the generational piece, right?
Yeah.
Because trauma is passed on.
Yeah, and I think that working at the center, we will always just kind of say it's the parent. Parent is having a hard time. Parent, is in a very difficult, contentious relationship with their partner or spouse or the family or responsible, and the child's manifesting a lot of that stuff, right?
Absolutely. So, Sandra, one question that I have for you, what are some of the things that you feel that you would have loved to know back then when you were just starting out, that you know now, and that you feel would have been so helpful back then?
Ooh, that's a really great question. When I started, I wish somebody would have really sat down with me and explained the aspects of, therapy and social work and, going to grad school. It's nothing compared to what you actually do in a therapy session. I think I followed my gut feeling and my passion to work with kids, and to want to help others process their trauma stories, right, and change them, or change the narrative. I think for me, I would have pushed myself to finish, and get my doctorate degree, because, even though it's only 2 years, I feel like that was one of the things, and I really could have done 4 or 5 years. Time went by so fast.
Yes, absolutely. So just going as far as you could with your education. Yeah. Well, it's never too late.
I know.
You can always do it.
Yes, definitely. And just to add on to that, I think that I think it would have been nice to reach out to more connections and resources and community of therapists, because there's so many people in different fields that I'm still learning about. There are therapists and they're doing this job, and how they're making a difference and impacting others, and one of the things that I'm like, hey, I want to go and teach at a community college and teach child development, so I can tell like these, new teachers, trauma is going to impact a child's behavior and their learning process,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so important because teachers, like they're really, they're really doing the work out there, right? With these kiddos for hours and hours. We see them once a week for an hour, but they're with them Monday through Friday for all hours.
Such difference. I think that, whenever I've had somebody in my life that they're teachers and they understand psychology, how they are like, oh, I can identify what's going on. And
yes, absolutely.
Child, right? It's a little one going through, they're having a hard time, right? Coping with whatever is going on in their lives.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, well, Sandra, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for sharing about your journey and your expertise. And for folks that listen to this and would like to get to know you better or perhaps even work with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, so I have my website, www.sandraascencio.com.
And I'm going to include it in the show notes as well.
Okay, yes, my name is kind of long, but you can find it online.
Yeah, I'll put it in. I'll put the whole spelling in the show notes.
And then I also have my Instagram page where I put like motivational quotes of affirmations, times when you need to do some self-reflection. So yeah, and if you'd like to get to know me, visit those sites, and that's where my story is, my treatment approach, what I'm doing today. My next goals with trauma are to get trained in brain spotting, learning, again, other tools, right?
Yeah, because there's so much out there, right? Sometimes it's overwhelming, but yeah, it's in brain spotting. I think it's a good approach, especially because you do EMDR, because it's like the next step, right? It's an added layer to the EMDR work. So wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Sandra, for this. And I will talk to you soon.
All right.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you found it healing and nourishing to your mind and soul. If there's a friend that you think would benefit from listening to this information, please share it. Share about our podcast. If you feel called to, please leave us a review, as this really, really helps boost our presence here in Apple Podcasts, and it makes it easier for others to find us. To stay up to date on new episode releases and special events and projects that I'm working on, you can follow us on Instagram at Inner Healing Paths Podcast. And you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to my website, which is rosachetty.lcsw.com. And I will include this information and links in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing with you again next time.